Hello and welcome to Vision Denial. My name is Sam, and if you're new here, I've watched every single playoff game of every international competition, yes, including that one, for the last 5-ish years, and done so on this channel for the last 4-ish years. And this year is no different. If you followed me on TikTok, the link will be down below, and all the rest. I've been following all the playoffs up until this point, right before the World's qualifying series, and I am doing my series of Meet the Teams. But that's not what this video is titled. This video is titled something along the lines of things you need to know, a la, but not actually that situation. Title I will figure out at a much different time. This is more of a brief synopsis of all 23 teams. And I said 23 because even though there's 22 teams, World's qualifying series has not happened yet. And both of those teams are worth at least discussing and comparing with one another. So, without further ado, here is our last Worlds Watch. Things to expect and to know for our Worlds. But first, a brief caveat. Down below, you will see a link to a Google Doc or an Excel or spreadsheet, a Google spreadsheet, in which I have accumulated a host of statistics, of which are important for the way that I analyze all of my particular stats, as a conjunction of the notes that I have taken for each particular game, as well as these stats that I've collected, doing so through GOL and through the Wikipedia itself. Aggregated the stats of all of the players that exist that are going to be playing at Worlds, of which that includes, should probably know that, all the way to the end, 122 different players, and that includes substitutes and main roster. I've collected the stats of all those teams, including the 23 other teams, in regards to various relevant and less relevant stats, but sometimes are contextual and add a little bit more understanding of what's going on. I've collected them for the year-long play, their summer-only play, and their playoff-only play. And playoff to conjunct specifically includes playoffs and regional finals, if relevant to when that had happened. I mention this because in regards to collecting some of these stats, the LPL regions have limited stats that they release. A lot of them are kind of hidden, and specifically those in regards to vision and some neutral objectives are the two major note points in which it is hard to actually evaluate strongly how well these teams do. But I do have contextual notes, of which I've collected throughout going through all of these playoffs, and as well as other different particular statistics that are still relevant and available that can shed some light of what our expectations of the LPL teams will be. With that out of the way, let's head off to the rest of this video. With that out of the way, there's a first thing that we really need to consider, and I'm going to be breaking down this video into 3 major parts: World's qualifying series, play-ins, and Swiss. And then through Swiss and World's through play-ins and Swiss, within those, I'm going to be breaking it down from region and then team. Instead of just trying to go through seeding and what seems to be the strongest team, I'll be putting a priority on the results from last year's Worlds and this year's MSI, in terms of which team should have a priority focus of who to speak to first and last, weakest first, strongest last, for the little shebang. I mention this because not all of the teams have qualified yet, and that includes 2 specific teams, one from EMEA and North America from the LEC and LCS. So let's talk about the elephant in the room that is the World's Qualifying Series. Let's start with Team BDS, the 4th seed from the LEC. A couple of things to note with Team BDS. Being a fairly new team and having finally gotten the chance to qualify for an international competition, it's a little disappointing that it will be the World's Qualifying Series first and not straight to Worlds, or at least to them. When looking at BDS, you'll be hard-pressed to look at them as more than just a neutral objective team. Their low gold approach early game, their lack of proactivity with the kind of drafts that they secure that requires and is super reliant on scaling overall, makes it very difficult to really push the envelope, especially in regards to some of their pros. They're very well set up for their neutral objective play, specifically or especially around Drakes. Their unorthodox champion pools allow them a lot of breadth of creativity, although the creativity that comes about likely has more to do with Adam than the rest of the team, but they still do flex around a lot of fun from this. And it creates some interesting coordination in areas that are rather unexpected and do catch teams off guard early in if they're not prepared. The key players I have notified here being Adam and Crowny. Adam particularly because he's a sore thumb. His champion pool is bizarre and unorthodox, especially with his Darius, which seems to be a sticking point amongst the drafting phases. Still leaves a lot to be desired when he plays standard compared to the rest of his contemporaries, especially within the LEC, let alone the rest of the world. Crowny, on the other hand, has been the most consistent player within BDS, being relied on more than anything else when the rest of the team can't seem to quite get it together. BDS has a lot of creativity and fun, but a lot is needed just to push them to the edge, and it will be up to us to see if they can actually compete with their opponents, being as they are in the other side of the bracket, or the other side of this matchup within the World's Qualifying Series. We got ourselves North America's 4th seed, Golden Guardians, who, as a particular team, had many with strong expectations and didn't deliver where they should have. For the most part, they are incredibly strong in the early game, have incredible coordination overall, and understand and have great adaptation for their win conditions. You see their gold per minute very high up compared to many of the contemporaries. Their whole shtick is they know exactly what they want and they get ready early game. And this becomes a problem when it comes to the mid to late game transition, where it really suffers. Their continuous ballooning of leads is not consistent. They don't really know how to choke out or even grow their own leads past the point of the early game. Closing out games is a really sticking point for the team, as they'll find themselves lost under execution, waiting for their opponents to create an egregious mistake. And it becomes unfortunate because the coordination is really there and you really see it, especially within their key players with River and Huhi, who together early in recognize the exact win conditions that they need to pouring out and go to those lanes and to those points of power that they need to get those particular win conditions. And you see that especially in the way in which they get huge amount of the heralds that they need, the number of turrets that they're able to accrue, where they allocate the plates and gold where necessary to get their win condition, and it's just not quite there. And it makes it weird for me to even compare them to BDS because, well, let's talk about that really. Because when comparing these two squads, it's really a mismatch of play. You've got over here Golden Guardians, who have a very strong early game foundation, a great understanding of their win conditions. They play very standard and very coordinated in a way that is expected of a team, and you can see that reflected in the amount of heralds that they get, and the amount of gold that they accrue, the plates that they play for, the tower leads that they regularly get. And they don't necessarily have a strong focus towards their dragons or much of the rest of their neutral objectives in a strong sense, especially given the comparison to BDS, who their unorthodox play doesn't necessarily make them hugely suffer in the early game, but are in negative tower differences, negative gold differences regularly, who don't have the same kind of application towards vision, but play towards their neutral objectives incredibly, whilst drafting sometimes unorthodox but very scaling approaches to their game. And so we have two teams here who heavy early game focus, hoping to win games early, but have some struggles of closing it off, versus a team who in the early game is not consistent enough to really justify the kind of drafting that they pull off, but do have a sense of coordination that catches people off guard regularly and can bring out victories through their scaling approaches that, once achieved, they know how to close out games. A team that plays late game very well but doesn't really know how to get there in the early game versus a team that does know how to get there in the early game but doesn't play late game well leaves a particular flip the coin. Either one can win. And I'm kind of looking at the stats and looking at the games on retrospect. I first thought BDS would be an easy shoe-in, but historically North American lower seeds tend to take the better of the European lower seeds, or in the case the EMEAs, the LEC's lower seeds. And I kind of want to lean towards Golden Guardians actually securing this last slot, but I'm not certain. Golden Guardians had such a strong, promising approach to playoffs, and they just never delivered, while BDS didn't have that kind of strong promise and still played in a way that I think most would be okay with. And it's really just on the sense of, has BDS learned from their mistakes? Are they going to actually properly focus on the early game play? Or is Golden Guardians going to finally get how to use their gold properly? We'll have to wait and see with the sticking points. For now, if it was just as is, I would really lean towards Golden Guardians, but just barely. I leave to hear your thoughts down below. But next, let's focus on the play-ins. With this, there's currently 7 teams because the last one, as mentioned before, has not been found out yet. There are 7 teams here. 2 from the PCS, 2 from the VCS, and 3 from the rest of the emerging regions, including LJLs, LLAs, and CBLOL's representatives. I'd be hard-pressed to say that this is going to be like a wash on some teams. Some teams really have a good, solid grasp of what they have to do, but this is probably going to be one of the more competitive play-ins we've seen in a long time. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of these individual teams, starting with, we have Japan's LJL's most famous team. We got ourselves Detonation FocusMe. Who is surprised? Quite literally. This is the team that most expect from this region to come in, and with the history and just the status that they hold within the particular region, it's no surprise of the situation. But some may be surprised by their current roster, and it is to be noted that their play at MSI is not going to be reflected in their play for Worlds, but it is something to consider within the difference. Their pros, some things that we expect. They're strong leaders, and coordination in general is excellent, have a solid understanding of their own personal win conditions, and balloon leads excellently once they have them. And coherently, however, or conversely, their vision play is not consistent. Their macro choices tend to take the backseat in favor of skirmishes and team fighting approaches, and have a tendency to choke and overplay their hand as opposed to just really sticking to consistency. And this, as a point of note, is different from how this used to be a problem in the spring. Because, and I mention this because their key players with this team is not because of like a statistical point or who they are consistently holding up, but because the context of what their squad is now. Udapon, who most people consider being a very core foundation towards the team, has taken to going back to the top lane after disastrous roster choices, going back to his roots, and replacing him bot lane is Milan, who has really taken up the mantle excellently, having stayed as one of the more consistent players among the roster. And with it, Udapon people don't know this, is an excellent top laner and will be a huge surprise for many, as his champion pool is flexible, and having played 3 different roles, his champion pool is much larger and has a wider breadth than people would expect. But this also comes at the expense of what used to be their understanding and coordination macro-wise in the spring has taken a backseat to what is now just a very fundamental coordination towards team fights and some setup towards neutral objectives, which is nothing to scoff at, but is not their strongest point yet. It'll be just to see how much they have still improved going into Worlds compared to many of the teams who have not had to make this kind of adjustment over the split. Next, we have LLA's representatives in Movistar R7, or Rainbow 7 as most understand them to be, a team who's during the summer had very little competition against them, which leads to some games that look very wishy-washy, still coming out on top for them, and others in which their coordination looks fantastic. The one thing from them, at least, is that they are excellent at preparation and adaptation from games. A very proactive team towards their win conditions, and they're at least consistent in terms of their approach towards neutral objectives. There is no doubt in my mind that they will have a plan for every team they know they're going to face. But their overconfident plays leading to some inconsistent understanding of what their win conditions, on top of the fact that they don't properly control the pace of the game, leads to a team that really overvalues individual prowess over the larger scope of coordination overall. And you can see this in their key players. Miru and Seo, who in themselves are usually the large bulk of carry and damage with their team, are carrying the games individually in ways that should not be. I would coin it solo queue-esque. The team itself are incredibly smart, very well prepared, understand and adapt properly from game to game, but sometimes in a way that is not desirable. Too much individuality, not enough full-on team consistency. So that's the thing that is a large concern, but I can also see them knowing exactly how to pick and prod at their opponents in a way that will largely surprise them. Next, we have CBLOLs in the Brazilian leagues. Loud. This team is great. Couple of things, though, right? This team with a lead, caveat, again, with a lead, incredible approach to closing out games and ballooning them. Understanding their win condition, and is a well-coordinated machine, and with the neutral setups that are incredibly consistent to boot. This team with very little competition to them in their region, which means a lot of this has to be taken with a grain of salt. But very little competition meant that we rarely saw them with deficits after the early game. And as a matter of fact, when they did have deficits in the early game, it was met with kind of a lot of lackluster, a lot of struggling, and a need for their opponents to do absolutely nothing. There's this impact where, yes, the coordination is existent and well, but you can tell that the individuals are doing a lot of the setup here. We take a look at their key players, Robo and Talons, who as solo laners do so much to create pressure and setup for their teams in these team fights that it does not bring me shock and surprise that when behind, their setups are just not there. They don't provide the same kind of guarantee and secured approach that they would have if they did have a lead. And when going into Worlds with so many other teams having drastically improved for the most part from MSI or from their own regions post the spring split, I would be hard-pressed to say that I do have some concerns regarding Loud's ability to compete here, but they are very well, they do well in understanding how they do win games. It's just, can they get those leads to do so? Next, we head towards Vietnam's VCS, and specifically with one of the most inconsistent teams I've seen, Team Wales. Now, when ahead, they've got some solid vision around neutral plays, they got great coordination with those particular leads, and have a solid understanding towards their drafting, especially when they've come off from a loss. But a huge lack of proactivity. They are struggling with their early game approaches, and they're inconsistent with some of these adaptations that they have. This team deeply has an issue with just where they want to go overall. Some of their stats on their highest of highs look fantastic. And then they struggle against every other team. Just, it is disappointing because, heck, looking even at their key players, Beanjay and Artemis, who apply so much pressure. Great amount of setup from BJ, who really plays towards their approach to win conditions that Team Wales do understand. And Artemis, who with every single lead plays so much damage and actual team fight approach. The coordination exists here. But it's hard for me to even think or conceive that this team is going to do well at all at Worlds, given how much they struggled to even qualify against a team whose top laner was inting the entire series. They were struggling against this team. They did get better. There is a sense of improvement with them, and hopefully going into Worlds that improvement stays and grows. But for the moment, it's hard for me to see them as a team that's going to do well. Next, our second representatives of VCS, their first seed, we've got ourselves GAM Esports, who so many know them from being known as the Marines to a whole bunch of things. This is a team that has represented Vietnam excellently. And some of their hiccups, however, from MSI leave some concern, understandably. And going into the playoffs, GAM still showed some of those concerns. But between their incredible coordination, their very consistent drafting choices, and win conditions that they really approach for, they understand the way that they win and how they go about it, and not really actually just opting into scaling approaches or overly relying on neutral objectives to win the game, as much as a lot of teams use as crutches. You end up with a team that is incredibly solid in its foundation, which you can actually notice from their key players, from Getsy and Slater, who are incredible team fighters in their own right. Always on the ball with a sense that is quite phenomenal, really. Incredible to watch. But a thing to note is that between their vision, their awkward approaches to neutral objectives, which is a kind of a counterpoint to them not really relying on it, and a lot of their micro plays where individuals tend to go off with some errors that are less savory than others, I'm fearing that GAM may not be able to really shine within their ability to play the macro choices or their global choices very well, or their team fighting ability and their coordination, because of the small individual errors that are often caused by the lack of vision that they don't usually apply as incredibly or as well as anybody else within the play-ins, coupled with their overzealous approach to laning, or at least within any part of the game. So we'll see if they can actually shore up some of those really ugly portions to make their bread and butter shine. We then head to Southeast Asia with PCS's first representative in their second seed. We got ourselves CTBC Flying Oysters, who are not new to the international scene, but comes to a great surprise to many that they even qualified. I cannot stress enough that let's go for some of their benefits, right? Their players are individually very strong, and they know how to play with their leaves and know how to punish indecisive teams. In fact, their bread and butter tends to come from them being the stronger laners in and of itself for most of the time, and that's reflected in their key players, which is just their bot lane. You got ourselves Shun and Xiaoxi, who incredibly control their lane in ways that is very, very satisfying to watch. And their team fighting and overall map pressure, great. But this team really succeeded off the coats of 3 poor best-of-5 opponents who dropped the ball incredibly. And in a semi-final appearance against Beyond Gaming, who were the favorites by far going in, who also dropped the ball. This cannot be overstated. This is a team with very poor fundamentals overall. Their coordination and team fighting is questionable at best at times, and there's an over-reliance around neutrals and scaling to end games, as while they may understand how to play with leads, they don't know how to close out games consistently. And I'd be hard-pressed to say that the Flying Oysters are like you should just completely cast them to the side as potential winners within the play-in bracket, but I would be dishonest to say that this is a team that you should be expecting to even leave the play-ins as it is. They have chance to prove wrong. They've gotten better over the playoffs, and there's no doubt in my mind that they have succeeded and even excelled in international competition. But as they are right now from their playoff performances and over summer, as well as all over the year, this is not quite the team you might want to bet on. Next, within Southeast Asia's PCS, we got ourselves the headliners of the region, Paris Saint-Germain, Talons. If you think of the PCS, this is the team you think about. And quite honestly, for very good reasons. Between their clean coordination, their very strong but set style, and their continuously proactive play, always looking from early game to late game to properly hit the win conditions in closing. This is just the team to beat within the region, which can come with some issues. Now, their coordination and their play themselves is really well properly set up by especially their key players in Junja and Maple, who are, one, creating a lot of early game leads and early game setups for their entire team, and continuously and proactively looking for setups that are appropriate around neutrals, closing out games, dives, so on and so forth. And then we come to the crux of their particular weak styles, which is very hard to tell because there's very little competition within the region. They've lost very few games. Heck, some of the games they lost are mostly when the opponent is actually playing at their best. They look cleaner when they're actually punishing their opponents, which is not great to say because if their opponents are not doing anything, they kind of look sloppy. Not a great look. And on top of it, they have a very strong set style, but they have very little variety to their play. They're kind of predictable in a sense, but in a way that is very hard for their opponents to really crack. So, like, on the one hand, this is great. It's a very solid way to end up at Worlds, but it's also a very solid way for people to prep. And it's just a matter of seeing whether or not it's a fluke, and so they just have a region that is very weak, and they're the big fish in the little pond, so to speak, or if this is a symptom of how well they'll be doing at Worlds, which will be very difficult to tell until they actually face off against an opponent that arguably they might not actually get to have until the Swiss stage. And let's take a look at that. When it comes to the PCS, and when you're looking at the brackets themselves, you see a bunch of matchups that, quite frankly, I can only see it go down one direction. The Talons, PSG Talons, is likely going to qualify. Much of their opponents, unfortunately, have very inconsistent playstyles or are very hard. They have struggles playing from behind, and even when they play ahead, they're very error-prone, a thing that the Talons will just eat up very easily. In fact, in Bracket A, looking at the 3 contenders between Loud, GAM, and Movistar R7, it's very hard for me to even be convinced that they'll have a chance against them. And then looking across the bracket, whoever might be the second place in that, which is probably not going to be the winners of the World Qualifier Series because they're likely going to have the same kind of benefit, so to speak. Fingers crossed in this situation. If they face off against the Flying Oysters, we know what that result is. If they face off against Team Wales, we know what that result is. Detonation FocusMe is likely going to be the only team out of there that is going to bring in some competition. Some. And even if it's not Detonation, if it's one of the world qualifying teams, That's the only other team that I can think that will bring some competition to the situation. And even then, those two teams are not looking great. So if there's going to be a bet, put your faith in the Talons to make it past to the next scene or to the next stage. And from bracket B, it's still a mixed bag. Much of these teams in the play-in stage are excellent. This is probably going to be one of the most competitive play-in stages we're going to have in a long time. The most competitive that I remember is 2018, the year that Cloud9 made it all the way to the semifinals. Semifinals. And then like last year, which was, I don't think necessarily as competitive as that year, but was still very surprising. It would not shock me if one of these teams goes way further than people expect. But even then, there's quite a bit of problems that exist between Rainbow Seven's very lack of competition that existed within their region and their lackluster statistics / playstyle. Team Wales, very questionable play. GAM's a huge amount of mistakes, or like just in general, that keep popping up despite their very strong coordination. Detonation, who is shaky at best and continues to have a choking problem even with their change in roster, who make them look really good. The Flying Oysters, who had opponents that kept dropping the ball up until the finals, which was the Talons again. Loud, who by far I think is one of the stronger contenders in this lineup, but still had a lot to like ramp up to before actually getting to a Worlds caliber point. And then the Worlds qualifying series representative, who both are fourth seeds, which large question marks attached to them. The Talons are the only very convincing team out of their region, and it's from a lack of competition. So it's kind of up in the air, but the Talons are my only confident go for it on the situation. But we'll have to see. Heading into the Swiss stage. The Swiss stage is one of the situations where, because it's a completely new format, just nobody really knows what to expect in this particular situation. It is harder, but not impossible, harder to really get the sense of who we should be expecting as the headliners. Now, there are some very obvious top 8s that people can go for, and even some top 4s that people can go for. But given that these are still best of 1 games up until elimination or qualification, which were best of 3s, it becomes a little harder to really tell when somebody's going to be like, the guarantee to go, which I think is a fantastic design. But let's take a look, actually, because our major 4 of the legacy regions, being North America, EMEA, or the LEC, or Europe, however you want to go for it, Korea and China, from the LEC, LCS, LCK, LPL, really have some solid teams that they're sending, with some noted caveats of asterisks attached to them, where they may not be terrible, but I probably would have preferred to see them in the play-in stage, so to speak. So, without dilly-dallying, let's go through them region per region, starting with North America's. Starting in North America, we got their 3rd seed, a team which I would believe would benefit from also being in the play-ins. We got ourselves Team Liquid. Most people are not too unfamiliar with Team Liquid into the international scene. I would be hard-pressed, however, to say that this was a Worlds caliber team. North America isn't setting what I would say they're most consistently best this year. First things first, their vision play, their early game macro options, and their adaptation with their drafting from game to game is quite excellent. It is consistent. It would be not surprised that you see them in the first 10 to 15 minutes of the game playing solidly. But between lacking the ability to balloon leads constantly, or inconsistent proactivity and inability to keep up with the pace of the game, or barely even able to close out games, which makes their games last way longer than they really need to be, you end up with a team that sadly has very little identity around how to do things outside of the early game. Their key players between Summit and Yan are more of a sign of our main goal is to see if Summit can cause enough chaos around the map and is able to dominate his lane, or we default to our bot laner Yan, who by all rights is incredible to watch at his peak. But this is two players who, in terms of the core of the team, is not going to be having that much coordination between the two. This is not a team that is like top side focus or bot side focus. This is a team that's scrapping for whatever is available at any time. And while that flexibility is good on paper, without the consistency of being able to balloon leads or be proactive at every stage of the game, this flexibility means absolutely nothing. Next, we have our second seed from the LCS, Cloud9, a team that most people are very familiar with at this particular point in the international scene. As a heads up, I do put their core players as Berserker and Sven, their bot lane duo, but this is a team that's fairly flexible in and of itself. They have a very solid understanding of how to have win conditions for every single one of their roles. They have excellent vision play, balloon leads solidly once they have those leads, and have a great approach to the pace of the game and their win conditions. But that's about as far as it goes. Most people expected this team to, once going in as first seed in the playoffs, to cinch the first seed within the LCS going into Worlds, but that did not come to be. They do not play well from behind at all. They are inconsistent within their early game, and honestly, where I would praise their coordination, because when ahead and when things are rolling smoothly, the coordination they do have within team fights, within macro play, with every single aspect of the game, it is immaculate. This is an incredibly well-oiled machine when ahead. But even when ahead, their players have, and I wrote it this way, a hero mentality. I wrote this with their particular notes in the NRG versus Cloud9 series, the first one they did. It says, C9 for their part concerned me even more. On multiple unnecessary risks in the hopes to either balloon leads, regain losses, come back from game. And when it works, it's great. But it shows me that C9 as a whole doesn't quite have the full confidence in themselves. And that's concerning. A team with this kind of caliber showing some weakness and some signs of inability to fully commit to their play and to their draft is not a great sign, especially when they faltered at the last second. Which leads to, we then have NRG, our first seed for the LCS. And if you notice some of the points that I put here down here, where some of the pros and cons actually kind of overlap with Cloud9's. They also have excellent vision play. They balloon leads very solidly, and they have a very consistent set amount of plays towards the late game. And you can kind of see this, as a matter of fact, especially with their key players with Contracts and FBI, who really create a lot of space and are very solid play, or they're very solid within their aspects of how they control neutral objectives, the play styles around, or like the team fight setups around those particular objectives that they want to go for. But in which, this is why it kind of surprised me that NRG actually made it to first seed and not second seed, is that between struggling how to close out games, their inconsistent coordination with a lot of micro and macro errors to boot, and very poor early game. In fact, being negative gold most of the time. It is baffling to me how much NRG was still able to take their early game weaknesses, pull through, and beat everybody within North America to get the first seed, which is indicative of a huge issue. They are first seed, about to face off a bunch of teams who do not mess around in the early game and would not give that particular kind of flexibility. I find that NRG as a first seed is less prepped than Cloud9, and yet I kind of am hoping they make it through despite all of the things that they've had to like deal with as in the year. there is still so much consistency. This was still the team that I found had more consistency overall despite some of their glaring issues. And that says a lot about the LCS going into this year. We head off now to EMEA's LEC with their third seed, Mad Lions. Mad at this point has been a fairly familiar face within the international scene between MSI and Worlds at this given section. This year, however, should be with tempered expectations. Now, and I'll mention their key players being Niski and Karzi, who really do a lot in terms of setting up their teams and a lot of team fight like pressure and damage, and they're excellent at when they are ahead and given the proper leads, and this is the sticking point. Well, yeah, they have some solid proactivity, some excellent macro play, and some solid draft adaptation. They do understand their win conditions in ways that are like needed for being World representatives. Holy moly, is their coordination so ever inconsistent. Their early game play is very poor, especially compared to across the board. And there are so many unforced errors, either as a team in macro play or in a micro decision. Every single player consistently in every one of their best fives have shown catastrophically, without mincing words, stupid decision making. Now, I will point out something here. Going across the board with the LEC, Mad Lions is the team with the best vision. It does not hold up to par with the rest of the world. Mad Lions is the best vision within the region, but it does not hold up to par. But it is consistent with their way that they play their macro, like how they play macro. And even then, given that detail, the fact that there are still so many unforced errors at play with the best vision within their representatives, it is not going to spark a lot of confidence. Next, we have the second seed of the LEC, Fnatic, a team who most people have expected. They've missed 2 Worlds since 2011, which is impressive in and of itself, especially this year where 2/3 of it, people had written them off completely. Not even going to be able to attend Worlds as it is. And yet, here they are with quite a bit of growing pains. A lot of roster changes, a lot of redefining their identity as a team, and it paid off, quite honestly. But some things that are going to be a theme within the LEC representatives, sure, there's some solid proactivity, some solid draft adaptation, some excellent macro play. These teams know how to play the map well. They understand how to go about this. So this is an understanding right off the bat. But they do not meet up to the standards of vision play, and they do not meet up to the standards of some of the macro play that the rest of the world is really used to or are accustomed to. But Fnatic is special. There's, granted, an over-reliance on some scaling drafts. There's an inconsistency to their execution of each particular play. Even if it's excellent play, they'll do it so solidly, and yet it'll fumble for some reason. And there's an inconsistent approach to their early game play. But when you watch them go, especially the tail end of summer and the playoffs for the finals, holy moly, Fnatic really went to it. And this is in key part to the amount of setup and work that were done by their key players. Razork and Trimby are on fire the entirety of playoffs. It is incredible to watch them go, set up for their win conditions, and properly actually create the space for their win conditions and for their players who need to deal the damage to actually go. I don't think that, going down the roster here, I don't think that Oscarin or Humanoid or Noah would have actually been able to appropriately face off against their opponents the way that they did if it wasn't for so much of the hard work put in by these 2 players who really work with as little as needed to get as much done. And finally, we have our first seed of the LEC, G2 Esports. And oh boy, let's be frank on this situation. G2 was by far the most consistently dominant team in the year, just throughout the year. They had a brief stint in spring where they kind of were not up to par, but otherwise throughout the whole year, just kind of a excellent type of situation. I do want to make a point of note. Again, pros, similar to all the European teams, every single one of them have some solid draft adaptation. They're excellently creative, excellent macro play, and understanding of their win conditions, and are so proactive within this particular region. So G2 is no cause for exception on this, outside of the fact that they really dial it to 11. And here's the thing. You'll be looking at this and going like, why did I pick Cabs and Trimby as the key players here? And that's because even though technically on paper within the stats you'd say Broken Blade and Hansama are the key players, and that would be worrisome because of how the top side, bot side of the map usually would indicate that you would need a lot of flexibility, which G2 does. They really do. But I mention this because between these two players is where the feast or famine or the caps or claps effect just kind of really takes point of note. There's a worrisome range of play that is shown. They look from either team that could win worlds, beat the best of the best on like just by sneezing, to a team that should probably be in the Challenger League from one game to the next, in a way that's quite frankly not something I would have uttermost confidence in. But G2 still managed to do it. Their feast or famine approach to drafting still creates some of the most creative draft options around. And they do play around it in some of the, I believe, quite honestly, to be the most refreshing approach to the game. But it is not consistent. That is the biggest issue here. This team has dominated the LEC against teams who are significantly more consistent than them, and they're going to wind up at Worlds not necessarily being able to do the same against teams who are on a different level when they're consistent. As we head up to the LCK representatives, we start with the 4th seed, Dplus Kia, a team whose entire brand is playing such excellent early games and yet failing to play the mid and late game. Can we please see something different from this team? It would be great. Because, yes, they understand the win conditions. They have excellent vision, one of the best ones of this region, strong early gameplay approaches. But it's still the same thing about having a hard time even being consistent within ballooning their own leads. Really struggling to play anything that's mid to late game. And even worse, you'll find them ignoring their opponent's win conditions and overvaluing their own in situations in which if they straight up do that, they'll lose the whole game outright. Which is unfortunate because their coordination is really there. Looking even at their key players, Canyon and Showmaker, who play a huge amount of roles in the way that they approach their neutral setups, their dives, the different team fights that they really go for. They shine and excel in this particular department. But when you face them off against the other 3 seeds who did qualify, it doesn't quite hold up to par. They do not have the ability to play outside of the early game, and that's going to be a strong problem going forward. Next up, we've got what I believe to be the benchmark team for the entirety of the tournament. This is the team to beat if you want to be able to win Worlds. KT Rolster, the 3rd seed of the LCK. Now, this particular team here was expected to get to the finals of the playoffs, no problems, not even any questions regarding it. But after 2 losses towards their telecom brethren, it's clear to see that this is a team who, despite incredible at ballooning leads, understanding how to close out games so efficiently, with an incredible amount of coordination at all stages, that if none of the leads that they require for their win conditions to go through, it is a clusterfuck. It is, quite frankly, very hard to even articulate how baffling they are at this approach. They are way more reckless when behind. Their macro choices suffer incredibly from poor side lane control. And this mostly shows against teams who are of equal caliber, if not better. The teams that they really struggle against is not the weaker teams, in which they handedly dominate. And you can tell if a team is way weaker than what the benchmark needs to be, because they'll just win. Like, they'll look like the cleanest team ever. But that's just it. They only look like the cleanest team against teams who are so much weaker. The confidence is not quite there for all of teams that are here. Now, going in, the main masterclass here, BDD, sets them up so nicely and allows a lot of space for aiming their other key player to deal the kind of damage that they need for the kind of gameplay and style they have. They do not let up at any given point with their consistent, relentless fighting and attacks towards any particular objective to win out the games. It's just a matter of, can they break out from their funk against stronger teams? Up next, within the LCK representatives, we got their second seed, the most famous team of all time, T1, which, quite frankly, who's surprised that they've qualified this year? No one should be. They had their brief stint with Faker, of which I do need to address up front. I didn't put him in our key players here, mostly because Gumayusi and Keria are the core part of the way in which T1 plays. They are versatile across the board. All 5 players here are carry players in their own right, but when it comes to their approach to the early game as well as neutral objectives and the way that they do team fighting, if these two are not in the right ahead, like if they're not ahead, there is a clear amount of struggling that happens with it. And this is part of the segue for where I'm going to start talking is their cons and before their pros. Their Faker effect is concerning because when Faker was not there for them, they had a non-stop losing streak. It was problematic. He's back, seems to be back in form, playing excellently, and it seems that there is a mental effect that comes with him being there, which, if he's still there, is great, but there is a huge focus that goes to him, despite the fact that these are the key players for them. Their drafting also is super problematic, and with it, because their drafting is weaker, they tend to overforce plays when unneeded, especially when they're behind. And it becomes a particular problem because when they win, they maximize gold to another level. Their macro choices, I believe, are unmatched in this tournament, and their early game doesn't ever seem wasted, especially when they get their leads. But it is to be noted that T1's strengths are so poignant that it is very hard to ignore the faults that come with it. Between how baffling they do their drafting, between just the fact that their players don't seem to have the right kind of focus from game to game, even though their bot lane is straight up where it's at. Like, this is still a team that when push comes to shove is one of the cleanest there is. And it does not surprise me if they are almost guaranteed top 8. Almost. In the last team within the LCK roster, the first seed, we got Gen.G. Gen.G here, I'm going to have to preface this in one specific way. This is the most consistent team across the board amongst every team that is qualified. They are scary, incredibly efficient with their win conditions, are consistent at ballooning leads at all stages, even choking out gold from their opponents and increasing the pace. It is without a doubt one of the scariest teams to go. Their key players, Peanut and Pays, are so efficient at what they do at all stages that the second that Peanut has gotten everything that is needed for his team in the early game, boom, Pays has picked up the gauntlet, everything is good to go. This is a well-oiled machine. There are maybe some hiccups when the games get very late and they skip steps, but this is more like par for the course. It became very hard for me to find cons for this team. This is an incredibly scary team. And in most cases, when you say a team has like very little competitions, they've lost very little games. Saying this from the LCK, to be very specific here, across the entire year, right? or across the summer here, they've lost 9 games out of 50. They've lost 9 games out of 50 in the LCK. This is a terrifying team. And in most cases, I would put them as favorites. But this is not the first time that Gen.G goes to Worlds, is slotted to be the favorite to win the whole thing. In fact, this has happened 3 other times. And they fumble very hard. And so, the biggest con that I have here is that Gen.G at Worlds doesn't usually cut it up the slack. I said it. So they may not be my favorites, but I'd be hard-pressed if we don't see them in the top 4. Possibly. Guaranteed top 8 almost. This is a scary team still, but you'll see. We head off with the LPL, which is the region I think that has the strongest chance of winning Worlds this year. First off, Weibo Gaming, who's the 4th seed, and I think by the skin of their teeth, because this is a super team, and we all know the stigma that comes with super teams, right? They have strong individual laners, they balloon their leads excellently, and have a solid understanding of their win conditions. And this shows with the way that their key players, Xiaohu and Light, who are incredible team fighters in their right, especially when given the actual gold and lead that is needed, great. But it's a super team, right? The super team effect is really there. They have bizarre micro and macro choices above everything else, and they have an inconsistent coordination going through. And this especially shines through across the board. In specifically, I want to call out the Shy here, who is, oh boy, in some respect to a world champion. He has won a title, but this is not the play of somebody who has consistently be at the top of his game compared to everybody else here. Light, Weiwei, Crisp, and Xiaohu, who are so good at what they do. Just, oh man, it's so unfortunate because out of all of the teams, this is the one from the LPL that I do not expect to make it out into the top 8. Just nowhere near close. But I do expect this team to be underestimated in some ways. So it's just a matter of, can they get their shit together, or is this just going to be a super team flunk? Next, we have the 3rd seed from the LPL, and a team that I think that was snuffed out of their 2nd seed, honestly, LNG Esports. This team has shown an incredible amount of growth, honestly, throughout the entirety of playoffs and regionals, holding, I think, straight up the 2nd best team by far going into Worlds. It is crazy. They have an incredible amount of neutral and vision play that benefits from their kind of style. Great macro choices overall. Their coordination is amazing. They know exactly how to win and how to get there. That said, the improvement, that kind of crazy run they had, is still a team that required a lot of improvement. They didn't come out of the gate strong as they did going into the end of regionals and the finals of the LPL. They still are prone to a lot of micro decision-making, mistakes overall, and are a little overzealous with the plays that they do approach. There is something glorious from this team that still needs a little bit of spit and shine. Now, their key players, Tarzan and Gala, are exemplary to the fact that they do play mostly around neutral objectives and then some side lane control, a very split 1-4 approach to things. And Tarzan does a lot in the early game to make sure that those leads are properly set up, and Gala, holy smokes, is he fantastic in these playoffs. I'm going to be so happy to see this iteration of LNG hit Worlds and likely see them improve game after game after game like they continue to do as they have from the start of playoffs. This is a scary team, no doubt. Next, we've got ourselves the 2nd seed for the LPL. We got ourselves Bilibili Gaming, who honestly, we all know who these guys are. The upstarts who did their whole huge run during spring, who kept up the pace, who were really good and kept losing to JD Gaming. That has to be addressed right out the gate, right? So long as JD Gaming is at Worlds, which they are, it is hard for me to even think that BLG is going to win. Will they make it far? Maybe. Probably. That really depends, because they are fantastically proactive. Incredible coordination across the bar. They hold a very scary amount of pace for their games. One of the faster teams amongst all of them that have qualified. But as they struggle with leads, are really overconfident with their approach, we come with a team who could not win against two of the teams that have qualified. They lost more games than they won in playoffs. They did not even go through the regionals. They lost in the quarters and just won off of points, and that is something to be addressed. Now, again, their coordination, the way they play neutrals, their vision play, this is still an incredibly solid team to do, like, overall, right? And I cannot just emphasize this enough. Between like Elk and Shun, who are the players, who are the key players within this team, the neutral play and the way that they really expand on their approach, very similarly, because the top three teams here very well understand how to play the side lanes and neutral game of this for this meta. I cannot emphasize enough that BLG is effectively a third seed of the LPL and not a second seed. Still very scary, should not be underestimated in any regards, and in fact will likely beat most teams that are not from the LPL. But their expectations should be tempered a little bit given how they're coming into this tournament. And the last team to actually go over today would be JD Gaming, first seed of the LPL, having now won 2 titles in the LPL, the spring and summer one, as well as MSI, and along their way, very close. They can taste it. Winning Worlds would be the only team to hit the hat trick, all 4. That would be crazy to see. Honestly, we got to take a look at a couple of things. JD Gaming, I struggled to find some cons against them. Between all of their players, incredibly flexible across the board, every single one of them could play a carry role or pivotal role to win any given game. 369, who is probably the more coin flippy of them all, still holds a strong aspect of the way that they play the macro aspects of their games overall. And Knight, who, holy smokes, is just at the top of his game currently. I would put them as key players, but honestly, across the board, you could get any of them. This is a team with fundamentals who are some of the best going into Worlds, maybe second to Gen.G, maybe, given to how they play. They have near perfect coordination going through it and are the scariest paces, like plays the scariest pace of the game than any team. I cannot stipulate how good JD Gaming is going into Worlds. Now, that said, they look average as a team when behind. If they do not have their gold lead, they don't suffer from not having a lead, but they are not excelling in the same ways if they did have a lead. And they're usually weaker around neutral plays, but again, that is me trying to find and nitpick their ways of like the approach that they have to the game, as opposed to just like how consistent they are in just everything. That, and in the early game, they are usually second to any given play. It is, quite honestly, maybe a little bit more of a hesitation with some of the very quick teams here. But otherwise, this is probably the favorite for the entire tournament. With this, having gone through every single team, the matchups from the World's qualifiers, the play-ins, and the Swiss stage, it's a matter of, most people would say, who do you think is going to win? The answer for me is JD Gaming all the way. Who's going to be top 4? Probably along a mixtures of JD Gaming, LNG, Gen.G, and G2. And then top 8 is a little bit more of a mixed bag because there is a lot of good teams going in. Some of the, I would say, underdogs in this particular case would be like the Talons. Paris Saint-Germain Talons is coming in despite the lack of competition in the region very cleanly and very consistent within their bar. Heck, NRG and Cloud9 could be considered underdogs within this particular right, although there's a lot more question marks that go with it. Things that I'm honestly just trying to look out for is that the meta is likely not going to be that different from their playoff counterparts in the earlier patches, and much of what we're going to find out is probably from the Worlds Qualifier Series before it even begins. I've mentioned who I think is going to win from there, the expectations of every particular role, and so to me, I think that this is going to be a very exciting year. Years in which it seems like it's very obvious who's going to win. It's going to be very one-sided from region to region, where like the LPL and the LCK look very dominant going in, is when sometimes there's a lot more wild shenanigans that's going to happen. So to me, after having explained my thoughts going through every single team, I want to hear from you. Which is your favorite to win the whole thing? Which is your underdog? I want to hear your thoughts about the things that have come through. If you want to go through some stats to back up your thoughts, I put a link down below with the spreadsheet that I have, like I mentioned previously, of everything that's going on. I'm not sure if I remember if past me within this video has said that there's going to be a video for each team. I'm not doing that this year. There is not enough time, and there's a lot of data aggregation that came from it. But all that information is publicly available down below. And if you want to keep up with when I do live things, I'll have also a link to my TikTok for when I do on a game per game basis reveal of my thoughts at that point. Thank you all for watching. I hope you appreciated this video with an informative, brief summary of every single team that has qualified. And I will see you when Worlds turns around. Have a great day.